Good morning. We're continuing our sermon series through the book of Genesis today, and I'm preaching from the cave, I realize. I hope it's a man cave anyway. So we're going through, we talked about Adam and Eve. We've been talking about different families in the book of Genesis, which Genesis is a genealogy, a book of genealogy of families and families throughout ancient Hebrew history. And so we've covered Adam and Eve. We talked about the first sin. We talked about Cain and Abel and last week. And then this week we're going to talk about Noah. And Noah, particularly Noah and his sons. Well, we heard a little passage read. Before we get into that, I thought I'd give it a little frame, kind of help us frame our understanding of Genesis and of Noah, because I came across a few weeks ago an atheist website that posed this question. And it was obviously a question meant to undermine the book of Genesis. And it said, how could 8.7 million species fit on this boat? That was the question. How could 8.7 million species on the planet fit on the ark? So I said, that's a pretty good question, right? The math just doesn't add up, does it? So I put my math brain on, and I started to go down this road. So I found out that there's a little bit more to that 8.7 million figure than at first blush. And I was surprised how atheists who pride themselves on rational thought and intelligence were promoting information that was not correct. There's not 8.7 million species on the planet by scientific standards. In fact, it said, as I went to the website, which was a scientific source, it was a source that they had come to a conclusion a few years ago that they estimate that there are 8.7 million species on the planet, but the disclaimer is give or take 1.3 million species, right? So that's a pretty big swing. I don't know if you do that, but that doesn't hold up to what I would call standard deviation in a research study, all right? I would not pass a doctoral degree if I put that information out there. It would not be valid. It would not be valid, great, so it's really a guess. The scientists are just guessing. In fact, as I dug a little deeper, I found that we've only identified just over 950,000 species on the planet. We're guessing there are 7 million more out there somewhere on the planet. And we're discovering biologists are discovering new species every day, every week. So I took that and I said, the earth is covered. Are you with me so far? Are you following the math? So I said, how much of the earth is covered in ocean? 71%. So a lot of the species that they're predicting are actually in the ocean that we haven't discovered yet. So I narrowed it down to just cut to the chase. I narrowed it down to the atheist question really should have been this. They got it wrong, folks. I hate to challenge atheists. They should have said, how did 700,000 land animals fit on the ark? That would have been the appropriate question. I don't know why they got it wrong. But 700,000 is a far cry from 8.7 million, right? So the math wasn't adding up either way, right? They weren't using good math, and they're obviously questioning the math. But all that is an opportunity for them to question and create skepticism and doubt about the validity of what we read in Genesis. So I'm there with that. So I think that's a good question. So now, how do you read Genesis? Did Moses take 700,000 animals on the ark? No. All right. It's not mathematically possible. In fact, it's not even exact science. Not even Moses. Moses, right? I didn't even know I said that. That's good. That's good. Trick question. I'm using that at 11 o'clock. All right. But that's an old joke, isn't it? That's an old joke. That's an old, it just comes out of me naturally. Sorry. And, there's a whole other story I'll tell you after the sermon about that and why I went there. But anyway, Noah, thank you. Did Noah take 700,000? Did Noah fit 700,000 animals on the ark? That doesn't sound mathematically possible, does it? So the problem is that the atheists, and sometimes we ourselves, read the book of Genesis, read Noah's story, and we read it through 21st century eyes. We know about 700,000 species. We know that. We've identified that today in the 21st century. My question is, how many did Noah know? In Noah's time, in prehistory, because you got to remember, all this was recorded after the life of Joseph. Genesis was recorded later. And so hundreds of years, thousands of years have gone by. Oral tradition has passed this down through the generations. And so how many animals did Noah know? I'm going to guess it wasn't 700,000. So my conclusion is this, that Noah took on the ark the exact number of animals that Noah could fit on the ark. That's probably what happened. And part of it is that we're also, in trying to do the math, we're also missing the point. Because Genesis wasn't written as a scientific document. It wasn't written as a mathematical, it wasn't important to the ancient Hebrews that all the figures line up. Because what it was doing was it was telling us truths about God. They were revealing truths about who God is in relationship to humanity and how we act in the world and what God does about it and how God responds to it and how we respond to each other. And so all this was what Genesis was about. It was about revealing truths about that, because 4 other cultures besides the Hebrew culture actually reports the flood story, independent of Genesis. So 5 different independent cultures, independent peoples, all report this flood story. The difference is that the Genesis account gives us a different view of God than the other 4 stories. And one scholar put it this way in one of the commentaries I read this week. He said, there it is on the screen. I don't have to get my glasses out. All right, good. The God of Genesis is shown as supreme and omnipotent, not struggling against very rival deities such as the sun and moon or monsters of the deep. What Genesis reveals to us is a God who is creator of the universe, who is over the universe and created us. There's not different gods fighting over each other and creating these things. And in some stories, the humans are blamed by the gods for making all this happen. The gods, so there's all this stuff going on. I won't bore you with all the other stories and the background and all the sources on that. That'll take a whole nother lecture. That would actually be a lecture, obviously. And you didn't come here for a lecture. And so here we get ourselves to Noah and his sons. This is after the flood. This is after all the good stuff happened. After the rainbow appears and they worship God and they say, thanks God for us for surviving the flood. And so all this happens and they get to this point, and it's interesting that the Bible leaves us with, this is the last thing we learn about Noah. And where do we find Noah? Where is he? Drunk and naked in his tent, yeah. Uncovered in his tent. And here he is, passed out from drunkenness. And so this is the last thing we learn about Noah in the Bible. Not all the good stuff. And we see that this man who is described as righteous and blameless and wonderful and faithful is drunk. He's a drunk. That's what we're left with. But it's interesting, and one of the reasons I think the Bible does that, and I think the Bible relates that to us, is because it makes us realize that nobody's perfect. No human leader is perfect. Because the other thing that came on that boat besides animals and the family was the capacity to sin. And Noah is just redoing the whole Garden of Eden all over again. And so what gets carried on with them is this restart, this new day, but again, this capacity for fallenness, this capacity for brokenness, this capacity of sin comes along with them, and that's where we find Noah. And really, I think what the Old Testament does time and time again is it shows these great human leaders, but also shows that they're flawed. King David was flawed when he had an affair. Abraham was flawed when he lied about Sarah. Moses was flawed when he took pride in something rather than giving credit to God. All these human leaders fall short. And it illustrates for us our need for grace and forgiveness, our need for Christ in the New Testament. Part of that's what's happening here as you read the whole Bible. And so that's why we include these flawed leaders in our scriptures. So we look at that. Now, but it's interesting because this passage is not so much about Noah's sin, right? If you heard it correctly this morning, it had more to do with how his sons responded to his sin. And this is where family dysfunction comes in, right? How do we respond when other people in our families kind of mess up, How do we respond to them when they fall from grace? How do we respond to them when they don't have everything together? This person that we thought was this great person now has this dark hidden secret in their lives that we're now finding out about. And so we see in the sons their way that the sons responded to what Noah's sin and Noah's brokenness. And the first thing we learn is that Ham responds with disrespect. I mean, he goes into the tent, and instead of covering his eyes or being embarrassed by seeing his dad, this is my interpretation, this is me imagining Ham going into the tent, right? He laughs, he snickers, he's like, check Dad out. I got him now. How many times have we wanted to one-up our parents, right? Like, I got Dad now. I mean, I caught Dad messing up, right? Yeah, look at me. I got him. And so he is actually, instead of responding and thinking about his dad at this moment and thinking about how vulnerable his father is at this moment in his brokenness, he is now thinking, boy, what can I do now? How can I take advantage of this, right? And isn't that the greatest fear within us about being vulnerable with who we are, is that we're afraid somebody's going to take advantage of the truth about ourselves? And so he's figuring out, I'm going to just do this. And how often do we I find that even in today's society, we've kind of lost our common decency. We've kind of lost our respect for what's going on in other people's lives, have we not? I mean, it's like, because this part of what's Ham doing, he's all focused on what he can get out of this rather than really respecting his father. Hold on a second. I got something here. I've been playing this Pokemon Go thing on my phone, and there's this like Rattata here I got to catch. Sorry, I get being to interrupt a sermon doing this, but do you all not think this is appropriate? Is this not common decency and courtesy right now? I don't know. It's interesting that Pokemon Go, they had to tell people, when you go to the Holocaust Museum, please don't play this. When you're at Arlington Cemetery, please don't play this, right? Because why? Because it's not appropriate in that context. It is not showing respect for common decency for that particular situation. It's not appropriate for me to play it now in the middle of a sermon, right? It's not that you can't play it. I say after you leave church, go play it. There's 2 Pokestops on the way out of church this morning. Go for it, right? Some of you, how many people have found the Pokestops here at Glenmar? All right. So all the young people are raising their hands now, right? So we found them. All right, good. So keep that in mind as you play the game. And please don't do it on the edge of a cliff like the guys in California this week. They survived, by the way. But so what has happened to common decency? Even as a pastor, I've witnessed it as I've been in funeral processions, how people respond to funeral processions now is not the same respect and common decency that I used to see 20 years ago. People are cutting in, cutting off, not respecting the funeral. So there's something about our society where we have stopped thinking about the respect for other people, and we're just thinking about ourselves. That's what Ham's doing in this moment. The other thing, though, that Ham does is Ham also responds with gossip. Ham becomes, last week I told you Cain was the first liar. Well, Ham's the first gossip in the Bible. Because the first thing he does is he goes and gossips to his brothers. He goes and responds with this gossip, and he says to his brothers, hey, check Dad out. Check out what Dad did. Look at what Dad did wrong. And gossip is really about, not just simply about telling about somebody else's sin, but actually taking pleasure in it. And a gossip is someone who takes a pleasure in someone else's brokenness, someone who takes pleasure in someone else's brokenness or sin and goes and points it out to others to make themselves feel better. That's what a gossip does. I remember being on we have a family vacation every few years, about 40 of us extended family members come together, and I woke up one morning and went to get breakfast, and something had obviously happened the night before because I could hear all the whispers, going on. And every time you hear somebody whispering to somebody else, you're like, oh, what's going on, right? What's the juicy gossip? I got to find out, right? So I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And it turns out that some of the guys had gone out the night before, late that night, to a bar, and they had all had a little too much to drink, and so everybody was whispering about the next morning at family breakfast. I'm just sitting there going, they didn't invite me? I don't understand why they wouldn't invite a pastor. I know why they didn't invite me. But the point is that, why did I want to engage in that? Why did I want to know? Why did they want to tell me? What's going on inside of us that makes us want to do that? That instead of being respectful and going to people privately and talking to them privately, we go and tell other people about their sin. And we talk about what they did wrong, because I think we actually take pleasure in it because it makes us look good. And that's just another way of us covering up our own stuff. Us covering up our own sin, us covering up our own brokenness and our own nakedness and our own vulnerability, because that's how we deal with it. Now, the brothers are good. The other two brothers are good and respectful in their response, because they actually, hearing this, they go to the tent, they take a cloak, and the image I get is the two of them, the cloak's over one shoulder and the other shoulder, and they're walking backwards into the tent so that they're being respectful to Noah, and that I don't know how they figured it out, how do they know when to drop these are the things pastors think about. I'm sorry, but when did he drop? What if they missed? Then they had to turn around, so how did they figure it out? And I get this idea that they walked backwards until they kind of hit the bed or the platform that he was on, or maybe they saw his feet sticking out, and that's when they dropped it, some details. How did he do it? So I think, but what they were doing was they were trying to be, that's how intentionally respectful they were trying to be. That's the point of that. How respectful they were trying to be. And interesting that Genesis, there's another book in the Bible. Who knows what the next book in the Bible is called? Exodus. And in the Exodus story, we get the 10 Commandments. And what do you think is commandment number 5? 4 about God and our relationship with God. Number 5 commandment is about our relationship to who do you think? Parents, right. Honor your father and your mother. Commandment number 5. I think this is in there because of that commandment. I think that's in there to start to remind us that we're to show respect. And isn't it hard to honor mom and dad when they're doing wrong? Isn't it hard to respect our parents when they're not doing the right thing? It's easy to respect mom and dad when they're loving and caring and doing all the right things and being good people, but what about when we find out their flaws? What about when we find out their brokenness? How do we respond to them? How do we respond to our parents' brokenness? The Bible teaches to honor our father and mother, and I think we can be respectful and honoring of parents even when they're flawed human beings. There's a way to do that. And I think we can do that. I am also thinking, and a part of this, and this is kind of me just speaking beyond the text here. So this isn't in the Bible. But there's a part of me that hopes, and I wish that the text said this, but it doesn't, so that's why I'm saying this, is that I hope that Shem and Japhet went to Dad and said, Dad, we're worried about you. Privately went to Dad to confront his sin. That had gone to him and said, we think there's a problem. We're worried about you. We want to help you. How can we make sure this doesn't happen again, Dad? Because too often what happens in our families, and part of our family dysfunction, is we just act like it never happened. How many of us have families where they're just things you just don't talk about, right? They don't even get acknowledged, that they're not even talked about anymore. It's like they never happened, they never existed. That's also a part of our dysfunction. So I'm hopeful that even though the Bible doesn't say it, that the brothers went to their dad to confront him about his sin in love, out of respect, out of health of the family. Because what healthy families do is they create a place where people can be vulnerable and loved. And isn't that what we long for? To be in a family, to be in a place, to be in relationships where we can be ourselves, be vulnerable, and still be loved, flaws and all. Max was the father of 5 children. Max was a professional. He was the president of his company. He had 4 boys and a daughter. Youngest one was a daughter. Can you imagine being the daughter of 4 boys? Some of you may be able to do that. But so he lived this. He was a churchgoer. He was well liked in the business community. He was well known. Everybody loved to be around him. He was the life of the party. If you looked at Max's life, you go, there's a guy who's going to heaven. It's till one day his wife dragged him to the therapist's office and said, you've got a problem. He said, I don't have a problem, but I'll go if it's going to make you happy. So Max went to the therapist's office and sat down, and the therapist asked him why he was here. He said, I don't know why I'm here. I don't understand. I don't have a problem. And the therapist said, well, what I know is that you have a drinking problem. He said, I don't have a drinking problem. He said, well, how much do you drink? He said, well, I have a couple drinks when I come home from work in the afternoon, or I'll have a couple drinks with my friends before I come home from work, and then I'll have dinner with the family, and then after the kids are settled, I'll maybe have a drink or two with my spouse or whatever. And so really, I don't think that's a big deal. I don't think that's a problem. And he says, look at all the good things. I'm a professional, I'm very professional about it. So the therapist probed a little bit deeper and asked the question, do you ever hide any alcohol? He says, why would I need to hide alcohol? I got a fully stocked bar in my basement. I don't have anything to hide. It's out there. You can see every bottle I have. He said, well, that's not the question. The therapist said, I asked you, do you ever hide it? 20 minutes, 30 minutes go by trying to get him to confess. And sure enough, he hid one in his desk drawer at work, he hid one in the garage, and he hid one underneath the seat of his car. But then he says, well, how could I be a drunk if I have this great family and I have this great job and look at all the great things I'm doing with my life? A drunk couldn't do those things. A person who had a problem couldn't do those things. Look at all the good I've done. And the therapist said, well, then why are you here? Why did your wife bring you here if there's no problem? And this is where his wife began to speak into the situation, and she said, because of Christmas. And he says, and Max said, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about Christmas. Therapist obviously said, well, why? What's the problem? Tell me about what happened at Christmas. And Max wouldn't even speak about it, wouldn't even talk about it. His wife began to share the story of what happened at Christmas. You see, it was the day before Christmas, and Max took that young daughter, his youngest child, the daughter, to the mall to buy some boots, like, Uggs, really cool boots that she wanted for Christmas. It was all the rage. So Dad took her down to the mall, put the credit card out, bought the boots for her for Christmas, and she took them in her arms, and they got back in the car, and they're driving home from the mall, and his daughter says to him, you're the best dad in the whole world. And he smiled. And on his way home, he decided, I deserve a drink because I'm a great dad. So he stopped at the local bar on his way home. And I forgot to tell you, this is in Minnesota, and it's the day before Christmas. It was 12 degrees out that day. So he said to his daughter, I'm just going to go in for 5 minutes. I'm going to leave the car running. He locked the doors, left the heater on, went inside the bar, said just for 5 minutes. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when he went into the bar. He came out 9 hours later at midnight to find his daughter in the car, engine had cut off, gas had run out, heater had cut out, doors were frozen shut, suffering from hypothermia and frostbite. Called 911, they took her to the hospital where she lost a finger and she had permanent hearing loss for the rest of her life. And when his wife told that story, that's when Max broke down. That's when Max fell apart, because now it had been exposed. The brokenness had been exposed. He had been uncovered. And isn't that what we do? Aren't we in some ways like Max? We're just trying to cover it up with all the good stuff rather than being vulnerable because we're afraid. We're afraid that if we're vulnerable, Ham is going to show up. We're afraid that if we're vulnerable about who we really are, that somebody's going to snicker at us, laugh at us, gossip about us, right? That's what we're afraid of, isn't it? We're afraid that somebody might find out the truth about us. Yet we need a place. We need to be able to go to someone and be vulnerable and receive love and grace. And that's what God does. Back in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve realized their sin and were sent out of the garden, what did God do for them? He covered them. He extended grace to them. That's what he did with their nakedness and their vulnerability. Brennan Manning, who I borrowed that story from in his book, The Ragamuffin Gospel, said this. He said, in order to free the captive, one must name the captivity. And God is the one who holds the keys to unlock the door of our captivity. It is God's grace and forgiveness that frees us and allows us to be who God created us to be. Amen.